All right, everyone, so this will be our first lecture, and this will be kind of the introduction to our course for the semester, because without this, we can't really go forward with anything else. So I want to talk today about score preparation, score study, and how you will move forward throughout the course with score study. So what do I mean when I say score mastery? This is really an important and very integral portion to our course that we're going to talk about. Score knowledge has 5 levels, and we are always going to start obviously at level 1, which is just a very basic knowledge of the music. This is the very first time you get the music. This might be a read-through, right? The second level is that basic structural knowledge of the music. This is where you start to have more of a broad understanding of the score, but you're still at a minimal level, having gone through more than maybe a read-through. The third level is where you're starting to make informed decisions about the music. You have a much more thorough understanding of the music itself. And the fourth level, which unfortunately is where a lot of people stop, is where the conductor is prepared to teach and conduct the score after making all these informed decisions. Our goal is the 5th level, where you can conduct the score from memory, having done all the previous 4 steps. It's very important that we get to this level. Our goal is always going to be to achieve level 5. There are going to be 4 important keys for you to learn the score, okay? 4 important keys to score mastery. The first one, score analysis. We're going to talk a lot more about this throughout the semester because it's different for each period, but score analysis is very important to the first initial learning. With score analysis, you're looking at the text, okay? The musical structure, that relationship of text to music. We're going to talk about whether you need a score marking system. It's a little bit less important to have a score marking system in the earlier periods than the later because there's more going on when you get into later eras than in the earlier eras. For example, when we talk about text, if you look at this, can you tell me what this translates to? Okay, if you're probably looking through it, this is in Cyrillic. It's a Slavonic text. And obviously you would need to translate this. And that's why text is something that you start with. And you must have literal translations. Word for word translations must be for every piece done. Even if you're using English, it's important to understand the context of what you're singing. Find the literary source. So we don't know necessarily where everything comes from, but in a lot of cases, especially in choral music, we're dealing with, especially if you're dealing with sacred texts, it's very important to know where they are. But even in dealing with texts that might come from, for example, if you're in the Renaissance, if it's a madrigal text, or if it's chanson from France, if you're in the modern era where the poetry is coming from. So, you know, the idea of finding that source material gives you some context for that. You're looking for any usage of symbolism or allegory by the composer and or the writer of the text or the poet. Again, the literary source and the significance of the text comes back, and it's very important in your performance aspects of this. Looking for poetic structure. A lot of times really good composers will utilize this poetic structure of the text in the way they set the text. And then arsis and thesis, and we will talk a lot more about this throughout the semester. You may or may not be familiar with the term arsis and thesis. This is the idea of a plus and a minus system. Arsis is something that is a lead. A thesis is a main idea. So arsis leads to thesis. For example, most of the time when you're using any type of anacrusis or pickup, you're going to be using an arsis. Da, D, that is an arsis, and the thesis is that downbeat. And you're wanting to find in the text where the thesis is and the arsis. Now let's talk a little bit about how translations and symbolism work in the text. So we're going to use, for example, the selection by Claude Debussy from the Trois Chansons, Dieu qui l'a fait bon regarder. Now, if you know the piece, it's a beautiful choral selection, obviously written in French, but learning about the symbolism of the text. Okay, a lot of people think of Debussy when they think of this text, but understanding that the text was written about almost 500 years before Debussy is very important. And it's also kind of interesting when you learn why this was written. For example, the text from the Duke of Orleans, he was a prisoner and he lived in England for nearly 25 years before he was returned home. The idea here is not about so much let's go. So France is the subject, is what I'm trying to say here. It's not about a literal female or a woman. He is asking to go home, essentially. He wrote this text while originally looking across from his imprisonment, the English Channel. He was later moved to the Tower of London and then moved all around the country throughout. But it's important contextually to understand what a person looking across to their homeland and missing that is. That gives a whole new context to your choir, to your students, and it's important to understand that symbolism. Additionally, the text is written in ABACA, which is a rondeau form, and of course, Debussy utilizes that. Another thing that we want to look for in our score study is musical structure. So you're wanting to look for tonal structure, melodic structure, repetition, the voicing, the form, and then the relationship of the vocal lines to the instrumental lines. This is especially important when we're in the Baroque and classical era, where at one time a lot of vocal lines were played colo parte by an instrument. And then eventually in the classical era, instruments started getting more importance in their own lines. And then this is the point where we get into the early Romantic era, where instrumental music really takes off. And it's very important to understand why those relationships began in the Baroque and how they evolved. The relationship of text to music, also known as, for me, I use the word affect, or the character of the music. What is the text and the music symbolizing? Is it giving you a feeling of sadness, of happiness, of joy? Musical ideas that interpret that text. Again, the relationship of rhythm. And you see the text comes back time and time again. And I say this throughout the semester. What separates choral music from instrumental music? The text. It's what we always have. Diction is also in relation a lot of times to articulation. You're wanting to look for things like that. Punctuation. One example I've used is a piece we've done in choir, Rets Kuriaya Dif Bayari. It's a Latvian text. It's a very famous folk song in Latvia. And the idea at the opening section is you have a 4-part tenor bass structure, and it's supposed to sound like the approaching horses. The idea that these are Cossacks trying to ride into town and create havoc, and it's that constant dun dun da 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 dun dun da 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 dun dun da 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 dun dun ticka taka da, and that's something that if you have that context when you're telling your choir, this is what that means. This is how that score mastery comes into play. Another really great example of relationship of text to music is He's Gone Away, one of the most famous SSA arrangements by Ron Nelson. And the text really comes back a lot, but the repetition each time is a little different. So the first time it might be He's Gone Away, it could be a love. He's gone away, it could be a father. She's gone away, my mother. It could be a bunch of different people. And this is how, as a conductor teacher, you're going to make these situations and evaluate them. Now, here when we get into score marking, and remember this is just day one, so we're going to talk more in depth about this throughout the semester. But this is Margaret Hillis's score study, and obviously this is a later work, really more of a modern score. But you see here that she utilizes, for example, a triangle for something that's in 3, a circle for something that's in 1, and this really gives her an idea of what to tell the choir to do. So it's 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, T, right? So there's 2 different ways of thinking of it: 1, 2, T, or 1, 2, T. Just right off the bat, she can look and see that. The other thing is she's highlighting where lines are moving. If you look at the green lines, for example, in the singen, you've got in the alto and bass there at the top, those are the lines that are creating the melodic movement, and then it's taken over by the soprano and the tenor in the bottom system. and then the lines continue, and you see, so she's highlighting that. Now, you don't have to utilize her system per se. In fact, we will go through and talk more about the best system that you can use for yourself, because it can get a little overdone if you want. This is the system I'm going to ask that we use. This is also in your syllabus, but what I want you to start thinking about is utilizing colors and highlighting. Primarily, this is a way for you to learn by marking your score. So you can learn when it's piano, pianissimo, mezzo forte, so forth and so on. Crescendos you draw in red, decrescendos in blue. And then I use a system a little simplified. Anything that is a simple meter, I tend to do in yellow. If it is a compound meter, I tend to do that in green or blue, and anything that's orange is an irregular meter. So you see the orange here in 5/8, you've got 3 + 2, and then the 2/4. This is just an easy way for me to do it, and I think we can come up with a good system that way. If we go back to utilizing this system, like I said, it can get very daunting, and I think that's a lot more than we need to do. I love the Hillis system, but I like to use this system. It's a little simpler. One thing I will ask you to always do is underline the important stressed words in the text. I use the example here of Robert Burns' poem, Red, Red Rose. Oh, my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. We could read that about 65 different ways, but I sing or speak, oh, my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. So that when we were to sing those texts, those words should be emphasized. And that relates to the arsis and thesis markings. You can put a plus over those words I have stressed and a minus over the other ones, or you can underline them either way. Also, always, always, always mark every bar in your score. Every bar. I use green because it's just always what I use. So I want you to find, again, a color that you can always signify for that meaning. Got to find something that works for you, right? There are intricate systems that a lot of people teach. I tend to be as simplified as possible because, again, this is helping you learn the score, and it's an eye catch. It's not supposed to be something that you overemphasize for. It's a tool, right? They're meant to be helpful. So it's a glancing thing to help you and assist, not something that should focus your time. All right, we're moving to step 2 now. This is where you're going to start making interpretive decisions based upon your analysis. At this point, you're going to be dealing with things like tempo, dynamics, articulation, the balance of forces, and that can be within the choir, or it can be the choir versus the instruments, or it can be even within the orchestra itself if you're working with more than perhaps a quartet or quintet of instruments. Ornamentation. A lot of times this is something that you'll have to decide, especially if you're going to be doing Baroque and early classical ornamentation with your choir. Now, with tempo, I think that a lot of times we run into trouble with tempo because if there's no metronome marking, what do? Especially if you're in the Renaissance and early Baroque era, right? So you have to make those decisions. A lot of times you have to find the fastest occurring note value to make that decision. So if every note value, for example, is a 16th note, and that's your fastest occurring note, that kind of gives you an idea. Well, what if all of your fastest notes occurring are quarter notes? Does that mean it's slower or faster? So you have to make these decisions based on your analysis. Look at the affect of the text. That's going to affect your tempo as well. You don't want to do, for example, a selection from a requiem, for example. If it's a lacrimosa text, you would not likely want to do that upbeat. However, it's Dies Irae, a day of wrath, you might want to do that one faster. So these are just some ideas about how these things affect you. Make decisions based on the music, all right? Not the ability of your choir, and certainly not the ability of instrumentalists. All decisions on tempo must be made based on the music, all right? So don't be afraid of slow tempos either. I know sometimes when I'm looking at a score, there's something that I saw one recently that said quarter note equaled 42, which sounds terrifying, but it is possible to do. Obviously, we know dynamics at this point in your degree, so that shouldn't be an issue, but they're not always indicated in earlier scores, especially in the Renaissance, all right? So you have to let music, text, forces, so forth, dictate that. If you're dealing with, in a Renaissance selection, a choir that's 8 voices and only 2 voices are in, it's likely that the composer's looking for a softer sound. If all 8 voices are in, obviously it's going to be louder. So you make decisions a lot of times based on those ideas. In the Baroque era, and for now, we're just going to use these terms quickly, Ripiano and Favoriti. These are really more terms that will come about when we're talking about late Renaissance, early Baroque. But this is the idea of soloists versus group. You just want to make those decisions. The dynamics can also come into play with that. Capella and soli is another German term for the same thing. With interpretive decisions, you're going to be talking about articulation, your balance of forces, your ornamentation. But all of that aside, those are decisions you're making at that second level. Now, when you get to the third level of score mastery, you're going to be talking about historical context, okay? The function of the music. What or where was this in the composer's list of works? Was this early? Was it late? What was it for? Performance practices of that period are also very important. So you're having to learn, you see, for each piece, you're learning quite a lot in this process. The languages, I already showed you that example of the Slavonic text, but there's a great deal more than just that. You might be running into medieval French, for example, or maybe Austro-Germanic Latin, things like that that are very important to know. Additions, are they good additions or bad additions, right? So you're wanting to find that out. I will tell you, anything that's free is not always necessarily the best addition, so you want to be careful of that. The functions of the music really can be a myriad of things. For example, the Sicut Cervus that most people know, in addition to its Secunda Pars Sitivit Anima Mea by Palestrina, it's written probably near the end of his life, has 2 parts. Obviously, you know, the composer is Palestrina. What was its purpose? Well, it was liturgical. It was meant to be done in a mass setting. The text should not have been split up into 2 parts, so a lot of people that do Sicut Cervus and stop don't understand that contextually it's supposed to be paired with the CTV. A lot of people don't, but it is supposed to be paired that way. Another example is O Schöne Nacht by Brahms. You know, originally it was written for soloists, not a choir, right? And the text was also very interestingly borrowed from his friend Heinrich von Herzogenberg. And we're going to talk about this when we get to the Romantic era. But this piece borrowed almost all the opening material from another composer and then reset it. All that to say, though, it was written for soloists. So it's very interesting that it's done now by choir. Does it really work with SATB forces? Obviously, very popular, so it does. But should we worry about the context of it being only meant to be with soloists? For performance practice, there's a myriad of questions that we're going to have to answer throughout this class. But one, do you do it with instruments or a cappella or unaccompanied? What is the voicing? Does the tempo affect things from that performance era? What are the dynamics from that performance era? Also text, you see the text keeps coming back, right? A lot of languages have evolved, so if you're dealing with French, for example, and it's from the 15th or 16th centuries, it's going to be different than modern French. Do you want to try and do that? For example, there's a really beautiful piece that I have done an edition of, Regret sans fin by Josquin de Prez. That is Middle French, and it has words and pronunciations that are different from modern day. There are extinct words, words that no longer are used or have evolved into new words. There's a great book, which you're going to talk about in a second, which talks about singing early music by Timothy McGee. This is it. And when you get into this book, he not only talks about, through IPA, the use of early languages, and also by early, we're talking Middle Ages and early Renaissance, but he also has a CD that you can download, I think now as well, that he pronounces these words for you so you can get an idea of what they sounded like. So it's really helpful when you're dealing with performance practice to find a book like this to do that. Now, editions, they run the gamut. So they're not all good, especially if they're free. If they use things like Common Time or 4/4, that tends to be not the best edition. If they use really bad phonetics, for example, you see here saw, li, te, and crease, te, That is a bad addition, and you don't want to do that, right? Don't trust something just because it's sold by a large company like J.W. Pepper. Now, we've gotten through the first three. The last thing is the communication of the score through your gesture, right? This is going to come back to posture, right hand, left hand, facial expressions, vocal modeling in the rehearsal. By the way, this is something I'm very passionate about you learning. Your left hand is going to be your expressive hand. Your right hand will be your temporal hand, as in what it's using the time and utilizing time. Your facial expressions, which you can see, there are three conductors here, all using different ways of emoting what they're wanting. I am a fan of that. Some people are not. I think it's wonderful to emote. I don't think you should mouth the words, per se, but definitely show the music through your face. Vocal modeling, however, is incredibly important, especially before you're in the conducting phase. It's the idea of telling you something versus showing you something. Right now, I'm showing you this PowerPoint while talking to you in hopes that it's helpful for you to see and hear, because being able to see something is a little easier, I think, than just talking. If you say, I'm on crescendo on measure 5, and the blah, 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 a lot of times the choir is going to tune you out. However, if you model it, they will likely do it correctly, lock it in a second time, and then you have what you want without going through a myriad of words. Modeling saves time, and it really saves frustration down the road. And if you don't get what you want, model it again. But they don't know what you want. You have to show them, okay? As we come in here to the final portion, I want you to think about this. Our choirs sing from memory. You must conduct from memory. Be able to sell to them the idea that memory is important. We're emoting and giving our audience and ourselves an artistic product. And that fifth stage of memorizing the score is very important. Make time for score study. You don't have to spend an hour, 30 minutes a day. Spend 10 minutes. Just look through a couple of places. And over time, you will learn the score better this way. But you have to make time for it. It's very, very important. Learn everything that you can throughout this course about the text, the composers, the poets, the music. You're going to enjoy the music more the more you know about it, right? And as we come here at the end, if you have questions, I want you to put them in our chat that we have, and we can talk more about this as class really starts to get going here. But I want you to think about two things as we go forward. One, in order for you to conduct a piece, you must have gotten at least to stage 3 in the process, okay? So you cannot start until you get to that stage. And the other thing is, you will be asked questions anytime we are studying a piece. I'm going